Good morning. It is Friday, the 24th of June, and I am sharing with you briefly this morning. We continue the saga of the book of Numbers. Today we jump through to chapter 20, and we look at the first 13 verses of Numbers chapter 20. And I want to just pause and say that how often have we not heard the little saying, history repeats itself. We look at events happening and we think, but hold on, that's happened before. Have human beings never learned from their past experiences? Why do we make the same mistakes all over again? Why do we always vote, for instance, greedy, corrupt politicians into power? Why do we always buy something that's supposedly marked down as a special, but every logical being in our brain is saying to us, but wasn't the price very similar just last month? Either way, Numbers chapter 20 gives us the sense of deja vu almost. We must just note that Numbers 20 has moved right toward the end. In fact, it is at the very end of the Exodus period. One can deduce that this is approximately 1 month away from the Israelites entering the Promised Land. We know that the Exodus took some 40 years. This largely because of the disobedience of the people and also because God needed to teach them and mold them into being a new nation. But we notice a number of things. The people rebel against Moses and Aaron again. They are now thirsty. They're in the desert of Zin and they are thirsty. You automatically think, well, perhaps this is right at the beginning of the Exodus, because wasn't there an occasion much earlier, the waters of Meribah or Massah, where Moses was commanded to strike the rock and water would come out? And here we get a similar occurrence. The people are thirsty. Moses goes to seek God's will. I think Moses is getting quite frustrated now. He's obviously a lot older than he was 40 years before. And the people have given him quite a lot of gray hairs. And God tells him to go to a rock. And this is important. God says, speak to the rock and water will come out. And so Moses obeys God to that extent. He takes his staff, the staff that he had struck the waters of the Red Sea and they had opened to let the people through, the same staff with which he had struck the rock and the water had gushed out. He takes this, he goes to the rock, he turns, and you can almost see in the verses, I can't now remember where they are, but he says, "You rebellious lot," and he strikes the rock twice. But remember, God's instruction was speak to the rock. And so there's a sense in which the words of Moses expresses deep frustration, as the commentary that I looked at briefly said the frustrations of Moses for some 40 years of leading these people bubbled to the surface, and he strikes the rock and the water comes out and the people are able to drink. It's a repeat of the historical events of before, the people lacking faith in God, the people rebelling against Moses. But what we also notice is the lack of faith and almost the rebelliousness of Moses, the leader. And so little takeaway is that those of us who are in leadership, and remember, I kind of say that we're all in some leadership or the other, let us not become frustrated with our people and take out some form of vengeance on them. Tough, difficult at times, but it's important that we don't take our vengeance out on them. And we note that history repeats itself. People will always rebel against the leaders. There will always be the car park talk. Doesn't matter how frequently the headmaster or headmistress may say something about this, it's going to happen. Things you talk about in a church council meeting are going to be shared more broadly, and everyone will want their little 2 pennies worth of input and try and control the church. This happens, so leaders mustn't get frustrated, or perhaps not let their frustration get the better of them. So we see at the beginning of chapter 20, verse 1, a whole series of culminative and big events take place. Miriam dies, the sister to Moses and Aaron. She dies. At the end of chapter 20, Aaron himself dies. We know from our reading ahead in the story of Exodus that Moses himself never enters the promised land. It's because God has told him this is Moses' punishment for his anger and lack of faith. He was told to speak to the rock, and he struck the rock. Instead, he was angry with the people, and in the face of God's grace, Moses exercised no grace. So another warning to leaders: exercise grace, and if you can't, just swallow hard and just postpone the meeting until you're in a better frame of mind. And it's, as I've said before, it's approximately a month before they enter the promised land. The people who are there rebelling, they are not necessarily the same people who were there at the very beginning in all the rebellion. There's no clear description of what happened from the earlier accounts where which we had looked at over the last few days. So 40 years almost has passed, a significant portion of that. And Scripture is, in many respects, in this instance, certainly quiet. What happened in those 40 years? We come back to this main camp at Kadesh, which is where Korah and Dathan, Abiram had rebelled against God, and we're back at that same camp. So maybe it was some kind of main campsite, and the Israelites would wander off in some circuitous motion and always come back to this one place. And yet always at this one place, rebellion would take place. Let us remember, people always rebel. Leaders, let us not wreak our vengeance on the people who rebel. Let us exercise the grace of God. And if there is to be punishment, let God determine the punishment and exact that punishment. It's not our role to do it. So that's the big lesson and message for today. And I hope that we remember it over the weekend and exercise it, change our lives for the better. Folks, have a wonderful day. God bless.